the directory to the files are on the right.
Yep.
Yep. That's the preferred way now over PSR 0. If you're 5.4 or less, then you have to use PSR 0. PSR is the PHP standards group. They're actually called PHP Fig. And then their suggestions are labeled PSR 0, 1, 2, 3. I'm an advisory committee. I'm not a voting member on the committee, but we're stuck on 7, 8, and 9 right now. You'll see a lot of emails and stuff going back and forth on that one. But PSR 4 for 5.4 and above is the way you want to go. So let's go ahead and go in and actually take a look at some code and do this. Cool. So we're collecting. There we go.
Let's just handle it. Okay, that's not on comms, it's in another side. Oh, it's fine. Yeah, yeah. It's just calm. I pay attention. That's what I was saying. Yeah, that's what I was saying. See, mine's not. You know?
That's what this does. This dot show. That shows the content. No, because that's it.
Can you turn out one of the lights to make it a little bit easier?
Oh, come on.
Please.
Get some glasses. I'm just kidding.
I get some glasses.
Come on, be tough. Woman up, man. I'm just kidding, you're good. Let me enlarge the font too. I don't know what it is in PHP Storm. Anybody know the Mac?
Command plus.
I tried that.
It's command brackets.
Command bracket. Or maybe it's that little lag that I get for some reason.
What you're just highlighting.
Yeah, I always thought it was Command plus plus, but if you're in an app, like you might have to go to the file menu.
Should just use Sublime, it's Command Plus.
Yeah.
Well, this is optimized for multiple monitors,
Yeah.
not for projection. Okay, so any other kind of library that you think we should use? Oh, we're at it before I add autoload our own stuff. Here's one I think we should add. It's up to you. Sorry, it'll be some project setup. I would probably go with Guzzle. That will make Guzzle/Guzzle. It's an HTTP client. You won't need it so much for the API that you're creating. But for part of Project 4, you're going to be talking to other APIs, and Guzzle's really good for that. You know, like when you're going to authenticate to the Twitter API, REST service. So I would probably add that one, and I just add it now. And I'd go with the latest stable version. So, let's see, I should, well, maybe I won't be. While that is bringing in, Guzzle, let's talk about the directory structure. So, when you install Composer, you have an autoloader that is generated, and this is the file that you want to require to bring in all the libraries. Or you can use, if you register the Composer autoloader, the Composer autoloader will autoload Slim and Guzzle and things of that nature. To require is a little different way of doing it. Either way is fine. The easiest way is just to require this autoload file. And so, don't worry about anything other than that. Okay, it looks like we have that format. And so, what was being talked about, I'm sorry, remind me of your name in the back.
Me? Clint?
Yeah, Clint. Mr. Eastwood. Is using the autoload syntax in Composer. I'm losing my voice.
What, yelling at the kids?
You need
Yeah.
for you?
I'm yelling at the kids. Hey, how'd that, have your child yet?
Yeah. We got to bring it home today.
Sleeping at night?
Today.
No?
And she had her first blowout too. So-
This is bad. Sorry, I gotta be.
I'm like, oh man.
Told me he's gonna get in being a pro at
Lots of
Shenzhen.
laundry.
I know.
Lots of diapers.
Dude, she never wants to keep her legs still. It's like, no,
That only works until they figure out how to move their hands.
TSR, PS, I think it's the dashboard.
And then
Brackets.
we begin our namespace, even if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so, does it parse through recursively?
Yeah, so the way you do it, like in our case where we have the source, you want to do you don't need to pass the / into it. You're gonna do actually file structure backslashing it. So you'll do common, in our case, we did common double backslash authentication, double backslash. And you have to do the double backslashes at the end, so that if you have anything that is similar, it'll read common and like common type if they're
Right.
put together as the same thing. And the double backslash terminates that out. And then now you tell it the path with your /. So source / common / authentication.
That way.
Yeah, source / common / authentication. And then anything that you put in the authentication, you put it under the namespace of common / authentication, and it will read through those classes and load them into that namespace.
See, and I just did like, pick my own namespace and just put source in there, it'll.
It'll do that.
I just,
Yeah, so you don't, yeah, I mean, as long as you name the space through,
Oh, yeah.
like you would normally, you would find all your directories, so if you ever.
Yeah, the only ones I copied over right now is just common and views were the two that I copied over.
Okay, copy won't need your views, but that's okay to copy them. It's not gonna be a problem.
Do you want us to connect to the service, you be able to connect to the service via any external app,
Via any external.
yeah, like, so we could access this API, if this was in production, we could be able to access this API from any external one, like use it as a login service. Is that how you're thinking this?
Yeah, but that's not gonna be required for the class.
No, well, I wanna know, do you want our view to be a separate app altogether, or is it
Yes.
gonna be within this project? It's gonna be a
Yes, for
separate
3 and 4, the front end, anything you see in a browser will be an exclusive JavaScript app,
Okay.
and that's
Completely
it.
separate project.
Completely separate.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
And then what's the back end, anything they want or what?
The back end
The ops?
is you're gonna have,
Like you don't want all 4 different sides, like memory and phone.
no, for 3 and 4, database and third party. Yeah.
So we shouldn't have any problems going from 2 different localhost ports, like running it.
No, in fact, what I'm gonna do is for project, I'm gonna give you a web server,
Yeah.
for the back end. And then I'm gonna run MySQL, and I'm gonna give you all that next week. And so it'll be easy to adjust. But I'm gonna run it in a Docker container, MySQL. Then I'm gonna run web server to run the API, and the Docker will be on localhost 3306. And then I'll just say, use this username and password to connect to the database. Here's the table name and the schema. I don't care what the data is in the database. Here's this, so I can host stuff, and then I will use my usernames and passwords to your service. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
I just haven't had time to do that, put that together. Okay, so, that's basically all that is needed, and then your authentication pieces that you've written in project 1 and 2, you just copy them there. Specifically, in fact, let's just go with the SQLite database. That way I don't have to worry about it.
Just use SQLite.
Just use SQLite and, excuse me.
So we only want to authenticate with SQLite, you say?
Yeah, SQLite on the database side, and then the Twitter API. So, go ahead for your SQLite, you can call it data. And just put your SQLite database in data.
In data, not in the authentication line. I put mine's stored.
I wouldn't mix data and code together. That's one of those practices you don't want to follow at the enterprise level.
Okay.
You want your business logic and your data separate. So in case one gets hacked, the other doesn't, and vice versa. And so we want, you want your source inside the source, public is accessible, and then data. Put your data in there. And then your source is also still gonna have some type of config in project one. Now, are you gonna use the auto loader? No. So you can move him to the trash. Probably still gonna have a bootstrap and a config, but because you're using Slim, that'll take on something different. So, let's go ahead and let's go to the Slim framework. Page. Now, because we've added some dependencies and some auto loads, you want to make sure that they're transferred to the composer.lock file. So you'll want to run composer.update.
If you're running it on a Windows machine, you have to do the PHP space composer.var space update.
Yeah, he's your Windows guy.
What was it?
PHP
You will always
space-
have a job, but it won't be happy. But you'll always have a job.
You do PHP space, then composer.har, and then space, and then update.
It would just be a lot easier if it was standard.
Yep, just update.
Yeah. My problem with
Until
Microsoft
the-
is they lock you in, they don't allow you much flexibility. And then once you become dependent on you, all their prices skyrocket. That's.
Yeah. For your dependencies.
All right, so here's a little example. But you probably don't want to follow that because you want all your logic right here in the index.
Sure. I actually, with mine, index requires an init, and init requires an autoloader, and that requires an app page, and then my app page is where I'm putting all of my endpoints for Slim.
See, that works too.
That way, index is online.
Yeah.
Require init, and that's it. Does nothing else.
You definitely want, you want this to be very, very, very slim. And so you can do something like, bring in your bootstrap and have your bootstrap do this stuff. Well, let's just go ahead and use what we have from project one. There's more than one ways to do this, and one way isn't necessarily better than the other way. You can adjust it to however your mind works, and that's okay. There's no problems with that.
As long as it runs on your machine, right?
No, it has to run everywhere.
That's what I mean, as long as it runs on your machine when you test it.
That's right. My machine's production. Okay, so index or bootstrap is in config, and we have to go 1, 2 up, correct?
No, because it's pulling from in public when it runs. So you're only going up one and then back into vendor from there, because vendor's on the same level as your public folder.
Okay, so the directory gives us the name of the bootstrap. Okay. And bootstrap. Let's follow best practices. Space. Okay, so we have to go up our bootstrap file. Why is that complaining? A dynamic include expression is not analyzed. It's one of those things that if you want, you can say, I don't remember what it is. You can add a comment. I thought you can, there's something you should say. Suppress for statement. That's just saying I can't determine if that file really exists or not for you
Because of the way that you're building.
because of the way. Yeah, and sometimes there's just no way around that.
So should we be building all of our paths with the real path in front of them when we're pointing to something?
Yeah, and you want to use these PHP globals because they're automatically set according to the operating system. And so that way, if you follow these type of practices, no matter what OS you're on, as long as PHP runs on it, you'll be okay. You'll be able to build your paths correctly.
So the double underscore directory is the directory of the file that's actually calling the method, not where you're running it from, like how how it was thought the last time.
See, there is, there's this one. File gives you the full path and file name. Dir gives you just the directory. And then you have class, function, method, and namespace. The namespace, method, and function and class stuff I use on debug logging comments for debugging. The real path gives you a fully qualified path, which in an operating system performs faster than doing a relative path include, because you have to cross, you have to make context switches between the user thread and the kernel thread. It just slows things down as you scale up.
But also doing the real path that way allows you to not have to think of where it's being called from to access what you're looking for, but where it's at versus where the other file is at.
Right.
Because I had a lot of where I had to, instead of thinking that I was actually in common authentication and looking for my authentication file, I had to realize that I was still in public and jump back and dive down in to
Right.
get to where the file is. But doing it that way, you can say this is 2 folder locations up from where this folder is at.
Mhm. Yep. And also, typically, if people can do directory injection and things of that nature and get a listing, they'll see your PHP code, and at first look, unless they know it, they'll, what? So it's security by,
Security.
yeah, not great security. Anyways, so we require the autoloader. We require our application config. And then, at this point, you can use another file or you can continue in Bootstrap.
Don't you want to, in this case, since we did the JSON, not require the config, since the config is what's labeling all of your namespacing?
Well, there may be other things.
You can configure all the stuff that Slim has, like login level and all that stuff.
Yeah, see, this guy right here, he contains classes and directories. You won't need this anymore, but you may still want this information. You probably still want to have your URI mappings somehow, so that they can be changed via the config instead of hard-coded in Slim. See, the examples that they give you here, or at least on the front page, like this line of code right here,
Yeah.
that's hard coding your namespaces. You can get around that and dynamically declare them and stick it into the config. I don't know if we'll get to that tonight. Other things that are in your config would be, what environment are you running in? Is it a dev environment? Versus, so you would have the code in here that would read an environment variable and set that in your config. Database connections, your API tokens for when you go talk to the Twitter to authenticate. You'll want to store that in a config. So there's a lot of other things as well. So you'll want definitely to have that included. But you're right, it won't have your auto load stuff. No?
Yeah.
All right, and then let's, at this point, we can go ahead and just say app equals slim, and then probably need some kind of app configuration here. And then after it's all configured, run. Okay, so. I'll just use their example right here to get us started, but I wouldn't suggest you stay with this. Because do you really want to configure your API in Bootstrap? Probably not. You may have something over here that says, let's see.
See, I just did under the source file, I did a new file, PHP file, and just called it app.php.
Mm-hmm.
And then in there, that's where I've been labeling in my HTTP endpoints using their structure that they show that
Right.
app goes to this. And I do instead of doing a new Slim in the Bootstrap, I do the new Slim inside of the app.php and run it at the end of that.
So let's add something right here. We'll say we'll have a debug statement. development. Um, Um, probably want to go back to our composer. We'll do this another night, but add a logger. We don't want to write our own logger, but if the mode was test, and you're in a test environment and you're running unit tests, you want your logger to be a null logger of some type. So when you unit test your code, you don't want your code to spew out tons of log files or throw exceptions that are uncaught. So at some point we'll have a logger in there. Let's see. That is. Looks like Slim has some log levels we want to go with. Let's say, that's a typical 9. We'll go, let's say 9 is full debug, 0 is no debug information. So a 9 would spew out everything, and a 0 would only spew out like an exception if the dependency is not there. Like if you go out and try to read the database and the database isn't there, of course you want to throw an exception. You want to gracefully catch it on the front end and display something useful to the end user. But for development, we'll turn everything full on. In fact, to make things easier, we can add another level of indirection. So let's just stick with that. And let's see what the format is. Let's get the logger. We'll flip the bits based on the development for log level. Templates path, view, cookie lifetime, it's not going to be doing that right now. Okay, that should be good. Now the reason I went ahead and did it this way is, let's say we want this application to maybe run under a different framework at a different time. We can come in and do something like this and have different configurations for different frameworks.
That's for when we make our $1 million right off this app.
Yeah, so you're gonna create a web service that's gonna make you rich. The whole thing being is right now, frameworks are a double-edged sword. They give you a lot of stuff, but they also give you a lot of stuff you don't need. And so, there's a movement that's starting to come out at the conferences, specifically this year. If you look at PHP Tech and PHP World, a lot of conferences are coming out about decoupling your code from frameworks. And so only using the frameworks that you actually, only using the part of the framework that you actually need. And so that's why you want to be able to decouple your code from frameworks. So once we're in here, but for this, we're running Slim. And so basically, if we do things right, decouple, we only have to change our config in Bootstrap when we change framework. And there are some PSRs that'll come out that'll make that easier. So according to the documentation, we can, as you can tell, I don't use Slim a lot. We can put an array in here. And we want the array from config. What was it? Slim.
It's app, so.
App. Yeah, thank you. And there you go. So that way, so everything under Slim config will have the same Slim syntax as you see in their documentation. So that way, you can just pass him in directly. Like that. So that configures that. And then, let's see, you included or required a file here that defines your API. Is that how you did that?
Yeah, I did a app.php, but that's where I also start Slim and run the app. It's in the app.php. It's not like Bootstrap
Okay, so
or my config.
so your index,
My index calls, we'll call in my config, and config will call the autoloader and register the autoloader for Slim. And then it calls in the app. So after you require in the autoload on your config, you want to do /slim/slim register autoloader.
okay. And I'm going to do things just a little bit slightly different, just to give a different perspective as well. But that works. Again, here we do the same thing.
PHP could have like shortened directory separator.
Like
stir set or something.
Yeah. It's like system.out, right line.
Yeah.
There's that.
Yeah, but when you do that, you might as well just type dir and that will probably.
there's a lot of different ways to skin that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so the bootstrap is going to, and see,
So on your, right where you're at right now, just after the autoloader is where I would do my slam.
right,
Yeah, right after that is just do /slam register autoloader. So that it registers what you've done with your autoloader from the JSON file. And then, yeah, register autoloader. Yep.
not yet, but it will be.
You have to get rid of the slash in front of common.
Be. I'm not gonna define it. Okay, so how do we want to store our endpoints here? Maybe we don't want to do the URI mappings. Maybe we want to call them endpoints. Now this is where you want to design your endpoint. So last week it was like, okay, talk to your teammate and start designing what endpoints, what the inputs are going to be, what the outputs are going to be, what methods they are, so on and so forth. Let's define those. So an endpoint is going to have a method to it, right? And an endpoint is going to be here. We'll use the whiteboard for the discussion. Okay, so what is one endpoint going to be? Let's talk about it.
Your first home directory of just the /.
Just the /.
Right now we consider that to be your login page.
Okay, so that's the URL. But remember, we're talking about the API only now.
Oh,
So isn't it just off or?
Okay, so we have an endpoint. Okay, so we'll call this the URL. And then we'll say what method is it. And then we'll say what action do we want to occur
So
with it. Look, this is just this is for discussion only. This isn't for
my
anything.
kind of following on that is what I did on my side to kind of keep HTTP requests separate from my API calls. Is I'm building API with /API/ and then what I want to do from there. So that I can say, if you're going to send me an API call, you're going to hit my web server, but then you're going to put /API for API calls.
Okay, so you had this go to your front end, and then this
API. And
would
then-
go to your back end.
Yeah, that'll go to the backside.
Okay, that's one way of doing it. What's another way of doing it? And there's nothing wrong with doing this way. I will complain if you do this. Don't make me change my freaking URLs because of your poor planning. If you're gonna deprecate version 1, just deprecate it. So that's the most indirection I like in an API. And everybody does the V1. But it's such a nightmare because they'll deprecate it without telling anybody, and all of a sudden stuff stops working and you have no idea why. Another way is you can have like domain.com be your front end, right? And then you can have this be your API. That's another way of doing it. I like as little as possible here because the deeper you go, the more cognitive load it requires, and the more cognitive load it requires, the more mistakes are going to happen. So this is another way. Here's a third way. So this domain.com, what port is this guy listening on? Right. So we could do something like this if you wanted. And that's your API, and that's your front end. The only time this works is if you have a load balancer and proxy in front of it, and this is an upstream server. We actually do this. All our API servers listen on to 15,000, but they're behind a load balancer and a bit. So they hit API domain.com, and then they're load balanced between that. That's a security measure in case they get behind the firewall.
So now
It helps reduce. So those are 3 different ways to do it. Now in your case, you're going to have stuff like, right? So you have localhost,
port 8080.
and see when you hit that, that's going to go on port 80, right?
80, yeah. Well, my question I have for you on that.
And
Do
so,
the API call on that same setup that way? Do we have to do a whole nother like Slim framework to get it to work with the API.localhost?
no.
You just should figure it to
Some
run
of
on
them
that,
just points
and he's
to it.
gonna build the front end on another run.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. This one, you have to play with your host file on your machine. I've done it in Windows, and it's easier to do it in a Linux variant. So this guy is actually on a IP that's different than him. and then you just put those two names in your host file, and then it goes. But they're both on port 80. This one, that guy's on port 80. The API is listening on port 15,000. And so you can serve both these guys up. So let's say you go this route. This route would, and we're using Apache, this would require 2 virtual hosts in your Apache configuration, which, you know, there's an art to doing that, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that one. But you have a virtual host for port 80 and a virtual host for port 15,000. If you do it this way, you have one virtual host with a redirect. And you could do that via a .htaccess file or a redirect command in your Apache config to say that when you see API here, you route that to the API code, you route this to the HTML JavaScript code. So any of those ways are fine or work. I'll choose a very simple way. So all you have to do is go in and say web server, and it'll launch the web server. I'll call it the API server or app server, probably app server. We'll serve this guy up, probably on a port. That's the easiest thing to do because that's just a command line entry, and I don't have to fiddle with anything. And then, so it'll be and then your AJAX calls will go to localhost on a specific port number, but I'll give that number to you, but for now, just pick one and work with it. Make it a config option when you start working with your AJAX. If you haven't worked with your AJAX, we're gonna nail that next week quite heavily. We're gonna jump into JavaScript.
When is this due? 23?
Wednesday, isn't it?
I thought it was due
No,
Yeah, I think it's
Wednesday.
the 8th.
See,
The 8th is what?
Wednesday.
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 Is it Wednesday? Okay.
Yeah, it's like a week from this coming Wednesday. And so by Monday next week, you should have your API pretty much running. So let's talk about endpoints now. So that's how we're going to host the API. Okay, what URLs do we need? Okay, so this isn't talking about the domain name anymore. Okay, so we need an auth. Okay, what HTTP method are we going to have that be?
Post.
Okay, a post. Okay, the action is going to be,
Verify login.
yeah, verify via SQLite. Okay. What is this guy? So that's the request. What's going to be his response?
The 200s are the HTTP codes, right? We're gonna say
Right.
make an HTTP code.
So we're going to have a 200.
Now is this API side, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay,
So we're going to have a 200.
or a 400
Okay, a 400 is,
failed, access denied.
okay, is it 401 or is it 400?
It's for something.
It's for something.
It's like 403 or 404
I
or
think it's
something.
03.
Till we know for sure, we'll do X. It might be 403. I don't know. I look at the list. I know where to find the list.
And then
Which is the secret to success. Knowing where to find the right answer, not knowing the right answer. Because there's just too much in computer science now to know it all.
So unauthorized is 401.
Yeah, that's the one. What's another one? Okay, we got a 500. We'll just go 500 or 550X.
Well,
No.
there's 300s, but not for.
Not- Not for this one. I can't think of one.
So your 200s
but
would be
there's-
successfuls.
There's another 400. actually.
404 is access denied or.
So 403 is forbidden, 404 is not found, 405 is not.
That's it.
404 not found.
So if I try to authenticate with someone who I don't know about, so I go out to SQLite and I come back and say, I don't know who this person is, what would I send? I wouldn't send a 200.
404.
Yeah, you'd send a 404. Now, a lot of web services out there will return a 200.
You wouldn't send 401, access denied? If you didn't find the person.
Well,
If you didn't find the database.
if someone sent the right username but the wrong password,
Okay.
then you would do something like that. You want to be nice,
Yeah.
and you don't want to force people to go into the response body unless they have to. So the headers are right there and available. And so 401 means when I see a 401 come back from an authentication, I say try again.
Yeah. Okay.
When I say 404, I'm going register.
Oh, okay. No, so that's what I was going to ask is with the register side of this, should we be catching these codes and doing like basically filtering on them and returning our own header that just says unauthorized instead of passing back just the 401 error itself, pass back 401 unauthorized. But if you get a 404, send back the link that says not found and then load the registration form so that they immediately go into register. And
Yeah, so a 200 says that this person exists, right? And so we send a 200 back, but what are we going to send back in the body? I'm sorry? No.
For the 404 you're saying?
for the 200, shouldn't we?
For the 200.
Shouldn't
Oh.
we redirect back to like
Redirect
a
them to like-
homepage,
yeah.
start your session and set your variables for that user?
Well, isn't it eventually gonna be like a profile page?
Could be something like that. The truth is it depends on how you define it. I would send back